Chapter 4. In July, Mrs. DeRosier had her husband move an old, musty-smelling dresser from one of the outbuildings into my room. It had a cracked, spotted mirror on it, and the thing looked like it was about to fall apart. But I was grateful to have something to put my things in, and wondered why this small kindness. Later, Mrs. DeRosier went out and bought an old cot from an auction, and had it put in my room. Since it was in worse condition than the one I already had, my curiosity was really piqued. I suspected that Maggie knew the reason, but I knew better than to ask her. She and Ricky had stopped calling my parents drunkards. I knew it was my lack of reactions which had made them ignore me for the most part. Now they were constantly at each other, to their mother's mortification and to my amusement. I was reading in the garden the morning the car drove into the farmyard. I glanced at it, not really caring who it was. I glanced again, surprised to see Miss Turner get out. My face had a grin from ear to ear when I saw Cheryl getting out of the other side. I dropped my garden tool and ran over to her. Cheryl, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Mrs. DeRosier had her phony smile showing, and she said to me in a pleasant tone, I wanted this to be a surprise for you, April. Your sister has come to live with us. We all thought this would be a good idea because your parents haven't come to see you, and then took Miss Turner into the house for a cup of coffee. I turned to Cheryl and asked her why she had moved from the McAdams. She knew that she liked them a lot, or I knew that she liked them a lot, and that they were real nice people. They asked me last month if I'd like to move with you. I asked them why you couldn't move there, because you didn't like it here, and they just said they didn't have the room. I told them that I liked them, but that I'd rather be with you. So here I am. Cheryl shrugged and grinned, as if she had pulled off a brilliant plan. From the day she arrived, I changed. I was more alert and openly defiant towards the DeRosiers, sending them silent warnings to leave my sister alone. We all did the chores together, and while we did them, we talked and joked around. While we did the outside work, Maggie would put on her bathing suit to tan herself. She would lay on the blanket whenever we happened to be working. The first time she tried to order Cheryl to go in and to get her glass of lemonade, Cheryl said, Get it yourself. We were weeding in the garden, and I was further away from Maggie and behind Cheryl. I stood up and eyed Maggie with such loathing that Maggie got up and went off to get her own drink. You lazy half-breeds, was her comment as she walked off. I bent down to resume my weeding, and Cheryl turned to me and said, See, that's all there's to it. They got no guts. Before Cheryl had come, the DeRosier's dog, Rebel, had always followed the Foster boys around, down to the barns or out to the fields, and now he stuck close to Cheryl's side. When I took Cheryl down to my favorite spot by the river, the big yellow mongrel came with us. Cheryl told me that the McAdams had taken her to see this movie, Old Yeller, and Rebel looked like Old Yeller. She'd tell me all about the television shows that she'd seen. Since I'd moved to the DeRosiers, I wasn't even allowed to go to the living room, except to clean it. Our privacy at the river was protected for us by nature. A few times the DeRosier kids had tried to follow me there. Maggie found the underbrush too scratchy and too difficult, and she had given up. Ricky had come down with a bad case of poison ivy for the first time. The second time, there had been too many mosquitoes for his liking. When school started in September, the DeRosier kids had the other kids on the bus picking on Cheryl and me. Cheryl was easy to goad, and she'd get into verbal exchanges of insults. It was impossible for me to get it across to her that that was exactly what they wanted from her. At home, there was a constant testing of wills between the DeRosiers and Cheryl and me. I grew tired of feeling that I always had to be on guard. I preferred the passive state I'd been in before Cheryl had come. I was worried that Cheryl would get into physical fights when I wasn't around. Fist fights were for people who couldn't keep their self-control. Furthermore, they were undignified. Because Cheryl hadn't made any friends in her own class, she often sat with Jennifer and me at lunchtimes. We had different recess periods. I guess she managed to keep out of fights because I had never heard of any. When our report cards came out before Christmas, Cheryl had maintained her high grades despite the DeRosiers. My own average jumped considerably. Knowing the DeRosier kids had done poorly by their mother's reaction, Cheryl and I were both vain about our own remarks. It was about the only thing we could rid them about, especially Maggie, and we took full advantage. We'd say things like, Hey, Maggie, you told us that half-breeds were stupid. Well, if we're stupid, you must lack brains altogether. It was the only time I'd refer to myself as a half-breed, to spite them. It was after Christmas that Cheryl got into trouble at school. She told me all about it at lunchtime. That morning, her teacher had been reading to the class about how Indians scalped, tortured, and massacred brave white explorers and missionaries. Cheryl's anger began to build. All of a sudden, had loudly exclaimed, This is all a bunch of lies. I'm going to pretend that I didn't hear that, the teacher said calmly. Then I'll say it again. I'm not going to learn this garbage about Indian people, Cheryl had said louder, feeling that she couldn't back down. Everyone else had looked at her as the teacher came and stood by her desk. They're not lies. It's history. These things happened whether you like it or not. Everyone else had looked at her as the teacher came and stood by her desk. They're not lies. This is history. These things happened whether you like it or not. If this is history, how come so many Indian tribes were wiped out? How come they haven't got their own land anymore? How come they haven't got their food? How come their food supplies were wiped out? Lies, lies, lies. Your history books don't say how the white people destroyed the Indian way of life. That's all you white people can do is teach a bunch of lies to cover your own tracks. The teacher had marched her down to the principal's office, and Cheryl had been scared, but she was also stubborn. She believed that she was right, and she intended to stand up for her beliefs no matter how they dished out. Her teacher had explained Cheryl's disruptive attitude and then left the principal's office. So what's this business of upsetting your history class? Learned men wrote these books, and you have the gall to say that they're wrong? The principal had boomed in his loudest voice. They are wrong, because it was written by white men who had a lot to cover up. And I'm not going to learn a bunch of lies, Cheryl had said, more scared than ever before. The man then pulled a strap from his drawer and said, Now I don't want to have to strap you, but I will. You go back to your classroom, apologize to your teacher and to the class, and there will be no more of this nonsense. All right? Cheryl had shaken her head defiantly. No, I won't apologize to anyone because I'm right. And then she put out her hand, knowing that he would give her the strap. And he did. Each time he hit her, her resolve had grown stronger and stronger. When he stopped to ask if she was going to come to her senses, she answered, Giving me the strap isn't going to change the fact that your history books are full of lies. Seeing he wasn't going to get anywhere, he put his strap away and phoned Mrs. DeRosier. She had arrived in about a half an hour and was angry. She told the principal she had nothing but trouble with Cheryl. He left her alone with Cheryl in his office. You're going to do exactly as they wish, or else I'll call your worker. Have you moved, and then I'll make you never see April again. Now, are you going to cooperate? Cheryl nodded meekly. The fight had gone out of her. Before Mrs. DeRosier left, she had turned and warned Cheryl, I'm not through with you yet, Cheryl Raintree. When Cheryl told me all of this, I swelled with pride. My kid sister was spunky. She had guts, more than I ever would have. But Mrs. DeRosier's warning bothered me. No doubt, Cheryl was in for a beating, and somehow I had to do something. For the rest of the day, I was nervous, but Cheryl didn't seem worried at all. That night when we sat down to supper, Mrs. DeRosier said, Cheryl, since you already got the strap at school, I'm not going to give you another strapping. Instead, you won't have supper tonight, and when we're finished, you will do all the dishes alone. Now, go to your room and wait till we're finished eating. I was surprised to find that was going to be Cheryl's only punishment. I told Mrs. DeRosier that I wasn't hungry since Cheryl had to miss supper. Very well, you can go to your room and stay there for the rest of the night. With that, she followed me to my room and commanded Cheryl to follow her to the kitchen. When Cheryl came back a few hours later, I looked up and I was shocked. Cheryl's long hair had been her pride and glory. There was hardly any of it, and it was all cut in stubbles. She told me what had happened. My anger mounted. After she had finished telling me about it, Cheryl added, and she made me sweep all my hair from the floor and then do the dishes. But I didn't cry, April, not once. Still, I wasn't going to let that old hag get away without voicing my opinion. My fury outweighed my normal fear of Mrs. DeRosier. I stormed into the kitchen, saw Mrs. DeRosier there, and demanded, Why did you scalp my sister? Instead of answering me, Mrs. DeRosier slapped me. I ignored the sting from that slap and yelled, You had no right to do that. No, two-bit little half-breed is going to yell at me like that, Mrs. DeRosier screamed back, and out came the scissors again. I actually pushed her hand away from my hair. I think we would have had a good fight, except that she used the threat of separating Cheryl and me for good. So in the end, I also went back to our room, minus my own crowning glory. I was still breathing hard when I walked in. Cheryl looked at me and did a double take. Her eyes, like saucers, remained on my hair. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but she remained speechless. She had heard the commotion in the kitchen, but Mrs. DeRosier's threat had kept her back. I looked in the mirror. My new hairdo looked worse than Cheryl's. There I was, the big protective sister, going out to avenge the humiliation of my little sister. And I came back, myself properly humbled. It all seemed ridiculously funny, and I started to laugh. Cheryl joined in. It was good to be able to laugh defeat in the face. Heck, our hair would grow out. The next morning, though, the DeRosier kids told the others that we had tried to dye our hair, and that's why our hair had been cut. We were jeered and laughed at. At lunchtime, I confided in Jennifer, and she went to the home economics room and got some scissors. In the washroom, she cut Cheryl's hair and mine so that it looked better. The aggravation over this incident gradually died down. The DeRosier kids were back to fighting with each other, although I sometimes had the feeling that they conspiring against Cheryl and me. Left to ourselves in our room, Cheryl and I did our homework and read a lot. Sometimes she would read my geography book and daydream, but mostly she'd read about animals and adventure stories. I was into Nancy Drew books and other mystery books, and occasionally I would read some of Cheryl's animal books. So far, I had not read the book on Louis Riel. Whenever Cheryl wanted to talk about him, I would change the subjects. I guess that she got the hint because she began to stay away from such topics. On Saturdays, Mrs. DeRosier would take her eggs in, do her visiting and her shopping, and usually her kids would go with her. Mr. DeRosier, Raymond, and Gilbert went to the work on the barns, or in the springtime, they would work in the fields all day. Cheryl and I would have Saturdays to ourselves. Since I was good at doing the floors, I'd let Cheryl go rambling outside with Rebel. One Saturday morning in the springtime, Ricky and Maggie didn't go into town with their mother. Later that day, Cheryl and I knew why. Cheryl was outside looking for Rebel. I was cleaning the kitchen. Ricky had already gotten a hold of Rebel, and he had brought the dog close to the house for Maggie to watch. Then, making sure Cheryl didn't see him, he slipped out of the pasture where the bull was kept. When he saw Cheryl nearing the pasture, he climbed back through the fence as if he had just come through the pasture. He yelled to Cheryl that Rebel had been hurt and that the dog was on the other side of the pasture. He said he was going for help. Thinking that Ricky had just come across the pasture, Cheryl climbed through the fence and started running. She didn't notice the bull raising its head to watch her. She didn't see it start to move towards her. Her mind was only on Rebel. As I saw this through the kitchen window, I flew out of the door, saw Maggie giggling to herself, and ran horrified towards the pasture. The bull was now charging across the field, straight at Cheryl. I called Rebel and raced towards Cheryl. I climbed through the fence and yelled to Cheryl to run. Cheryl heard the pounding the bull's hoof beats, and at the same time she heard me. She stopped to look around, and when she saw the bull, she froze in terror. I was screaming all the while for her to run, and at the last minute, she did move. The bull narrowly missed her. It slowed to a stop, and turned around. Cheryl heard Rebel barking, but she didn't know that he had streaked behind her and was now preoccupying the bull. I was running towards her, and when I reached her, I grabbed her hand, and we raced back to the safety of the fence. We turned to see what Rebel was doing. The dog was prancing around the bull, easily avoiding the short charges. Cheryl called to him, and he happily came loping back to her. Ricky and Maggie had stopped laughing, and they glared defiantly at me as I walked up to them. Without saying anything, I hauled back and I punched Maggie right in the face. Her nose started bleeding, and she landed on the ground. Ricky jumped on me from behind, and his weight knocked me off balance. Cheryl, who was still shaking, walked over to him and kicked him hard. I motioned for Cheryl to leave things to me. Ricky and Maggie fought back and screamed bloody murder. I was silent as I plowed into them. The fury in me wouldn't let their punches and their scratches hurt me. When my anger had evaporated, I stepped back and looked at them with contempt. They were bloody and crying. As I turned to Cheryl to ask if she was all right, I noticed Mr. DeRosier and the two foster boys in the distance. The boys who were standing just behind him had big grins on their faces. The first time I had ever seen this. The expression on Mr. DeRosier's face was unreadable. He didn't say or do anything. He just turned and continued towards the garage. At supper time, Ricky and Maggie came down after everyone else was seated. Maggie wore a sleeveless dress to show off the bruises and the scratches she had received. Ricky had also dressed for the occasion. As they expected, their mother noticed their appearances right away. "What happened? Did you two get into a fight?" Maggie turned on the tears so that Ricky explained. "April and Cheryl were teasing the bull this morning, and we tried to make them stop, so they beat us up." Before Mrs. DeRosier could turn on us, Mr. DeRosier spoke up in a quiet voice. Now try to tell him the truth for once. Before Mrs. DeRosier could turn on us, Mr. DeRosier spoke up in a quiet voice. "Now try telling the truth for a change. The tractor broke down this morning. I came back for some parts. You didn't see me, did you, Maggie and Ricky? But I saw you and what you tried to do. You're both darn lucky. I didn't have time to get to you first." "Are you calling my children liars?" Mrs. DeRosier asked him angrily. "They're worse than liars. What they did this morning could have got Cheryl killed. What the hell's the matter with you? You three make me sick." He slammed his fist on the table and silenced Mrs. DeRosier from saying any more. After a minute, he got up and stormed out of the house. Raymond and Gilbert looked lost. Even though they had barely begun to eat, they got up and left after him. The rest of us finished our meal in silence. Mrs. DeRosier told Cheryl and me to go to our rooms when we finished the dishes. I knew she wasn't going to let this go by without doing something, but I kept this worry to myself. On Monday, Mrs. DeRosier kept Maggie home from school. When we got off the bus that evening, Maggie was in her good clothes, and it looked as if she had gone somewhere. She looked gleeful and triumphant. She whispered to Ricky, and they went into the living room laughing. At the beginning of the summer holidays, about a month after the incident, I was in the house one morning when I noticed a car enter the driveway and saw that it was Miss Turner, and then it hit me. Miss Turner was here to take Cheryl away. Of course, that's what their secret had been. That's why we were never punished. I panicked. I couldn't be separated from Cheryl again. I just couldn't. But what could I do to stop it? Nothing. Nothing except for run away with Cheryl. But where could we go? Cheryl was outside somewhere. I didn't stop to think that what we would take. I just ran out the kitchen door and looked around the farmyard. I saw Cheryl coming towards the house. Ricky and Maggie were still upstairs sleeping. I heard Mrs. DeRosier calling for Cheryl from the other side of the house. I ran towards Cheryl and urged her to duck behind a building. Cheryl, Miss Turner is here. I'm sure she's come to take you away. I was shaking. I was glad to see Cheryl had her jacket on. April, I don't want to go away from you. They told me I'd never see you again. I know, Cheryl. We're going to run away right now. I looked around the corner of the building. There was nobody in sight. We ran across the open grain field as fast as we could, trying to keep low. When we were into the safety of the woods, I said, we're going to go to Winnipeg. I'm sure I know the way there. We'll just follow along the roads through the fields. When we get there, I'll try to find the Dions. I'm sure they'll help us. I know Mrs. Semple. She'll just believe whatever the DeRosiers tell her, okay? Cheryl nodded and we started on our journey. I had no idea how far it was or how long it would take. We followed alongside Highway 200, the same way we went to Winnipeg by car. We walked all day, ducking low in the tall grasses in the ditch whenever we heard a car. Sometimes we walked through the nearby woods. Once we saw a car moving, and when it came closer, we saw it was an RCMP car. I knew they were looking for us and that we'd have to be more careful. It grew dark and darker it got, the harder it was for us to walk through the weeds. We waited until it was pitch black and returned to the road. Cheryl began complaining that she was hungry and tired and wanted to stop and rest. I urged her on, saying that we would have a better chance of making it if we continued through the night. In the middle of the night, Cheryl insisted she just couldn't go on anymore. I knew how she felt because I was dead tired myself. We left the road and found ourselves in a field. Cheryl fell asleep, my head resting on her lap. I sat for a while to guard her, but soon I lay back and fell asleep too. I was awakened by somebody who prodded at me. The sun was shining down on us, and I remembered where we were. I felt exposed. I blinked and was dismayed to find a police officer standing over me. Cheryl was already sitting up, and she was still rubbing her eyes. We were told to get into the car, and I sat there glumly. The Mountie talked to us, but we ignored him and didn't say anything. I was so disappointed that I couldn't think of anything except that we had been caught. I wondered if running away was a crime. We couldn't possibly go to jail just because we wanted to stay together. I was surprised when we got to Winnipeg after all, but we were taken straight to the police station. We were told to sit in the waiting area, and after a while, the officer came back and gave us milk and cinnamon buns. I was wondering why we were waiting there. We almost made it, didn't we, Cheryl? I said. If I hadn't gone to sleep, we would have made it. I went to sleep too, Cheryl. Don't worry. We'll explain everything to them. I had read about the RCMP. I knew they were good guys and that they'd listen to us. I began to wish that I had talked to the Mountie in the car after all. We never did get another chance to talk to the Mounties. Mrs. Semple came in first, and she gave us a disapproving look. I never expected this of you, April. Mrs. DeRosier is worried sick. Don't you know how much she cares for you? You girls put a scare into all of us. You should be ashamed of yourself. Do you know what could have happened when you hitchhiked? Why, you could have been hurt. We didn't hitchhike. We walked, Cheryl said, sullenly. Don't try to tell me that you walked all that way. You girls have had a very bad influence on each other. She turned to stare at Cheryl. And you, young lady, I won't be surprised if you landed in reform school. Why should she land in reform school, I said. Bitterly, I'm the one who talked her into running away. I didn't want us to be separated again. And I suppose you're the one who attacked Maggie, Mrs. Semple asked. I beat her up, and Ricky too. They tried to kill Cheryl. After I said it, I realized it must have sounded ridiculous. Nothing was coming out right. I had wanted to explain everything out in a sensible manner, and instead, here I was sounding almost hysterical. You have too much imagination and not enough common sense, Mrs. Semple said. Mrs. Drosier brought her poor daughter in and showed us what had happened. Now they have no reason to lie about what they did. Who did what? It was a very vicious act, Cheryl, especially when Maggie refused to defend herself. Furthermore, Mrs. Rosier brought you a report from school to back her claim that you're a troublemaker. April, it's touching that you want to cover up for your sister, but if we don't do something now, she'll end up in reform school. I'm not covering up. I'm telling the truth. I shook my head in disbelief. And how come they couldn't see through Mrs. DeRosier and Maggie? How come I couldn't convince them of our honesty? And then I remembered. Mr. DeRosier set and the boys. He had spoken up for us once. If he knew about this, surely he would speak up again. Did you talk to Mr. DeRosier and Raymond and Gilbert? I asked excitedly. Mrs. Semple eyed me suspiciously and said, April, you're a beautiful girl. I advise you to keep your charms to yourself. Mrs. DeRosier told us you've been flirting with them. Of course, the old hag had that covered that too. After all, I just didn't know what to say. And then Mrs. Semple gave us a little speech about what she called the native girl syndrome. And you girls are headed in that direction. It starts out with fighting and running away, the lies. Next comes the accusations that everyone in the world is against you. There are sullen, uncooperative silences. The feeling sorry for yourselves, and when you go on your own, you get pregnant right away, or you can't find or keep jobs. So you'll start with alcohol and drugs, and from there you'll get into shoplifting and prostitution, and in and out of jails. You'll live with men who abuse you, and it goes on. You'll end up like your parents, living off society. In both your cases, it would be a pity because Miss Turner and I knew you both when you were little, and you both were remarkable youngsters. Now, you're going to end up as many other native girls if you don't smarten up. You'll end up in the same place they do, Skid Row. I thought if those other native girls had the same kind of people surrounding them as we did, I wouldn't much blame them one bit. Much of the speech didn't make sense to me anyways. I'd never heard of the terms shoplifting or prostitution, and I didn't even know what drugs were. I'd been into drugstores and they saw all sorts of useful things. So far, I hadn't had a crush on a boy. Well, not a major crush. And what the heck was Skid Row? All I knew for sure was that somewhere in that speech, she'd insulted our parents, and I could see that it rankled Cheryl. I held her hand. I thought of once more trying to talk with Mrs. Semple, but then Miss Turner walked in. Mrs. Semple went over to her, and they talked for a few minutes. Then they came over to us and told us we were going to the Children's Aid's office. There we sat alone in one room while they discussed our futures in another. I was still angry, and I felt like a criminal. We hadn't done anything wrong. Well, maybe I shouldn't have laid such a beating on those two brats, but it wasn't Cheryl but it was Cheryl who was getting all the blame. Because of the two of us, she was the more the innocent. It was unjust. Cheryl, I said quietly, what? I'm sorry. You're not the one who should be sorry. All of them are the ones who are doing wrong. They're the ones who ought to be sorry, Cheryl said vehemently. And after a few minutes, she said, I guess I'm going that syndrome route, huh? Of course not. Why do you say that? Cheryl smiled. I just kind of accused everyone of being against us, didn't I? And we both laughed. It was a while before Mrs. Semple and Miss Turner came back to the room. Mrs. Semple said to me, April, we've decided it's in your best interest for you to return to the DeRosiers. You never got into trouble until Cheryl came to live with you. No, don't send her back there. They're mean people. Mrs. DeRosier said that we'd never see each other again, Cheryl shouted. Cheryl, we've arranged for you to go to the Steindals. If you give them a chance, you'll be happy there. And don't worry, there'll be visits between you and April, Miss Turner said. Please don't send April back to the DeRosiers. They'll do something bad to her. I just know it. Why can't she come with me? Because you're not good for each other. Now, I don't want any more nonsense, Cheryl. April, if you can talk sense into your sister, you better try, Miss Turner said to me. I want to talk to Cheryl alone, I said, and the two women looked at each other, shrugged, and then left the room. I knelt before Cheryl and said, Cheryl, we can't fight them. I know I'll be okay with the DeRosiers. I don't want you to worry about me, okay? And I don't want to have to worry about you. I want you to be good at the Steindals. I want you to keep up your grades. This won't last forever. When we're old enough, we'll be free. We'll live together. We're going to make it. Do you understand me? We are going to make it. We're not going to become what they expect of us. I sat back on my heels and looked her in the eyes. She nodded and smiled through her tears. Okay, April, I'll try to be good.